Today on Missing, we are joined by filmmaker Melanie Perkins McLaughlin to discuss the disappearance of her childhood friend Andy Puglisi. Melanie is also an Emmy-winning documentarian for her work on the documentary Have You Seen Andy? And Andy Puglisi disappeared from a swimming pool in Lawrence, Massachusetts on August 22nd, 1976. Lance, what'd you think of this conversation?
It's always tough getting into these conversations when we're talking about any missing person, but it makes it even more difficult when the missing person is a 10-year-old. And I feel like Andy Puglisi was a name that we've heard several times just in this business that we do. And the right person at the right time had to come along to talk to us about it. And I'm really, really grateful that Melanie joined us to talk about her friend. It's really heart-wrenching to hear her say that even though they were young, like, they loved each other. You know, they were very good friends. There was this adolescent, this like childish type like affection for each other. And my heart was kind of breaking just imagining what their relationship would have turned into had this not happened. But she did the right thing. As she grew up, as she matured, as she started to understand the circumstances of the disappearance, turning that into what she's turned it into. So I love this conversation. I can't wait to have her back on the show again, hopefully with some updates.
Yeah, absolutely. We should definitely do that. And Melanie is also producing the Open Investigation podcast that delves deep into the story as well. And it is fascinating. And Lance, it is dark as hell. And so this is one reason why we are breaking up this interview into two parts. Very dense, heavy subject matter, and I think it just will help to kind of separate this interview into two parts so we can embark upon part two with fresh eyes and ears, because again, it's heavy, and I don't want things to just get lost because of how heavy it is.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, you want to make sure that you kind of get yourself back in check. And after 30 minutes of listening to something like this, you kind of want to take a breath and decompress and revisit it and finish it off in another segment. So yeah, that's the point of doing the two parts. Give a little breather in between, and I can't wait for people to provide the feedback on this. And even though Andy's been missing for almost half a century, I mean, we know that developments and leads can pop up if people keep talking about it. So I can't wait to get that conversation going.
Absolutely, and it's very timely too, with news about networks of pedophiles, in mainstream media today. This is, extra timely, I would say.
Right.
So we do hope you enjoy this, and please leave us a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and we will be back with part two, and we'll share some final thoughts at the end of part two.
And please be sure to follow us at Missing CSM. We're going to break real quick for commercial, and we'll be back with Melanie to talk about her friend, the missing Andy Puglisi.
Melanie Perkins McLaughlin, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
You are more than welcome to come on the show anytime you like. You are directly related to this really tragic, mysterious story, and you've done a great job in presenting it to the public with your show, but desperately want to get into all of that. We got to get some housekeeping out of the way. Can you introduce yourself to the audience, maybe a little bit about your background and what brings you to the show?
Yeah, totally. So my name is Melanie Perkins McLaughlin, and I am a documentary filmmaker, content creator, podcast host, a number of things, mom. I wear a lot of hats. And I had been working in documentary film for decades. And after, 10 or 15 years doing that, I decided it was time to make my own film. I had been working for other folks. I worked for PBS, I hate, my kids think it's really funny when I say, I started working for Discovery Channel when they first came around, which is true, when they first Discovery and History channels and what have you. So, but working for them for a while, I decided to eventually make my own documentary. And I knew it was going to have to be about something that kept me up at night, because I know how hard this work is, especially as an independent. And one of the things that kept me up at night was the disappearance of my childhood friend. So I had a crush the summer before fifth grade on a boy that had just moved into the housing projects where we lived in Lawrence, Mass. And we became friends. And a few months later, he vanished from a public swimming pool. And I was with him that day. I was 9 and he was 10. And, we were pretty marginalized kids in a marginalized community. And the day after he disappeared, like we were swarming with helicopters and planes and National Guard and everything else. But it was just 5 or 6 days later when everybody was gone, and the search stopped. And I didn't understand as a little girl how that could happen. I knew enough, in terms of being educated in science, that people don't just vanish into thin air. I didn't understand. And I made this very naive promise to Andy and myself that when I grew up, I would try to find him. And over the years, I would see things, that involved Andy. Like I remember coming home from high school one day and to watch like soap operas or something. And there was a news story about a psychic searching for him in Lawrence. And that kind of stuff would trigger me, but I didn't know what that meant at the time, right? So my podcast is also, and the documentary, I feel like are shared trauma, real trauma, childhood trauma. And so we really try to be trauma informed as well. And so I also want to make sure that anybody that's listening to today's episode knows that we're going to be talking about some stuff that involve child sex abuse, child neglect, that kind of stuff. And so CSA, CSAM. So we want to make sure that people, we have a trigger warning for people that might have experienced any of those things so that they know and they can prepare. But at the time, I didn't know what trauma trigger was. But I would be triggered occasionally in high school, like I said, with that news story I remember vividly. I remember a boyfriend coming back from the Cape one time with a picture of Andy from a real estate magazine, an ad in the back that like, have you seen me? And it was like an age progression to him at like 16 or something. So things like that would happen along the way. But when it came time to make the film, I decided that, I would use the skills that I had learned at WGBH and other places, researching and being an associate producer and licensing and, doing all those things to try to find out what I could. And very naively, that's how I started. And the first call I made was to Andy's mom, Faith, to let her know that I wanted to do this and who I was. And she didn't remember me initially, but, she knew our family. I mean, the project was pretty small. And Faith and I have had, a relationship ever since. And she's been remarkable. And I've become an advocate for the family and really, try to do what I can to help them find Andy, because I firmly believed as a 9-year-old that we could find him. And I still believe that as a 50, almost 9-year-old. So I continue the work.
I find that when you approach somebody with that bit of naivete, because you said you're a little naive and you called Andy's mom, I think that's great because a lot of times that just leaves the genuineness there. When you have too much information and you're over prepared, you almost sound like you're going at it with ulterior motives. But if you're naive and you sound genuine, which you are, like that goes a long way, I think. So even though you said like I was really naive, I feel like that was your strength when you reached out to her.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I definitely, we both of us, I don't think really knew what we were in for. We were in for quite a bit. But the first thing that she said to me at that time was, this is much bigger than you know. And I say that.
Wow.
Yeah, that was the first thing she said to me. And I was like, I thought, maybe she just, it was sort of the musings of an anguished mom, right? Like I didn't really, again, I was naive. I didn't really understand what she meant because she wasn't able to fully articulate it at that time, but she couldn't have been more right. And we're just like, I don't think she even imagined that it was as big as it was. Even now when we talk, we're like, wow, like we just can't believe everything that we've uncovered in the past 20 plus years.
Yeah. And in listening to your podcast, it feels like it just keeps getting bigger. Do you find that?
Yeah, I do, unfortunately. So when we did the documentary, I really felt like I did the documentary for a number of reasons. Like I said, it was time to make my own film, and I knew I wanted to do something that I cared deeply about. And I really wanted to satisfy these questions that I had for myself about what happened that day, but also for the community of children and families that lived there, right? Because this was a community event. This was a community trauma. It is still a community trauma. If you see people posting or commenting on any social media, they'll talk about how affected they were. They were part of the surge. to this day, how it affected their parenting. It still is very much a community trauma. And so I wanted to be able to give truth to what happened and share that with the community. And I was so grateful when the film was done and HBO said, hey, you can have a screening and you can have it wherever you want. You can have it in New York, you can have it in LA. And I was like, no, I want it in Lawrence at the Showcase Cinema where Andy and I, would go see, Grease or Jaws or whatever. And so we had it, and it was like 400 people and this whole theater full of, from kindergarten to teachers and, law enforcement and everybody else. And it was really remarkable to give voice to that. But I knew when I was making the film and when I had to turn it into HBO that, and you can see at the end of the film that I'm realizing that there's something else, there's more to this, like there's more to this story. And HBO, it was 72 minutes I was delivering, and that was it, and so I was not able to do more with that. And, at the screening, I looked out, I took a moment, I tried to be mindful and looked out and thought, be mindful and imagine, see this moment fully. And then I thought, oh my God, I panicked. I'm like, what am I going to do next that's going to feel this meaningful? And I had no idea. I was actually 8 weeks pregnant with our third child. And she had significant disabilities. She has Down syndrome and heart defect and a whole bunch of things. So the universe gave me my answer. That's what I was doing next. I wasn't going on the road with the film like I had anticipated or doing some educational outreach like I'd hoped. I was taking care of my family, which is also very important, of course. And so it would be another 10 years really in between from the documentary to starting the podcast that I really, got back into it deeply again. I mean, I was always getting tips and I was always, I was doing interviews and things like that, but I wasn't in it the way that you need to be in it to get the kind of research that we got from the podcast until again so the film broadcast in 2007. Was really happy, was driving down, the street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on my way to water country with my kids and my husband when we got the call from HBO that they had submitted it for Emmy consideration. So that was really fun. I just didn't even really think much about it. I thought, oh, that's kind of neat. And yeah, we'll go to New York City for a trip and what have you, but certainly didn't, expect, I don't know. I guess I didn't expect that it would win, but people had said that it would, and it did. And I was we were surprised. My daughter was back at the hotel with a sitter while my husband and I were at Lincoln Center getting the Emmy, which was really fun. And she held it back on the train when we were on our way back. It was fun pictures to have. And then the universe sort of, I got back and I think my fifth grader had, head lice, so the universe was like, okay, back to reality pretty quickly. But that was really cool. And it was for outstanding investigative journalism, which meant a lot because it was about finding answers to what happened. So that meant a lot, but it would be another 10 years. And what made me come back to the subject matter was again, a trauma trigger. Like I was, driving down the street and I had been contacted by someone over the years that were trying to get the police to do something and they hadn't. And suddenly the FBI were involved and they were digging, in the backyard of this man's home. And I heard it on the radio and I had been trying for years to get them to do that or to do something like that. So it just was so startling. I almost drove off the road and I went home and I just pulled out my boxes and, I talk about it in the podcast. It was like that. I felt like that, Godfather line or whatever, where it's like, just when you think you're out, they pull you back in, right? Like it was like getting back into this whole story and material again in 2017. And then knowing that it was so big, it was like, what am I doing? Am I doing a docuseries? Like, what am I doing with this? And I had just started to listen to podcasts, in 2017, some of the bigger names had come out and Bear Brook was really influential for me, for example. And The Keepers wasn't long after that, right? So these docuseries and things like that, I was thinking about how could I tell this story? And honestly, the more affordable way was podcasts, right? Like I was like, am I going to try to make another documentary and push this baby uphill again? Or can I do something more affordable? So I decided on podcast. And last September, almost a year ago now, we released a 9-part investigative podcast, which is the episodes are, between 30 and 45 minutes or so each, maybe a little bit longer in some of them. So 9 hours worth of material that really goes from what we learned from the documentary all the way up to last September, really, for the most part, which was a lot. And honestly, there's years of material from that podcast that I could keep working on. I mean, it does, you're right, Tim, like the more you dig, the more you find. And I finally come to the understanding that it's never going to end. Like, it's not like I'm going to get somewhere and, it'll be done. Like, even when we recover Andy, which I do believe we will recover Andy, even when we recover Andy, it won't be over because it's just an endless problem,
Would you mind taking us back to 1976 in Lawrence? Because that's an area of Massachusetts. Tim and I are both from Massachusetts, and I just love that area. I love the Lowell, Lawrence area. I love seeing how a community that once thrived on a certain industry collapses and then builds itself back up again. So in 1976, Lawrence was a lot different than it is today. Can you describe it back then?
Yes. So Lawrence was definitely always, and I think always will be, a blue collar community. And that was something that we all really pride ourselves on and continue to pride ourselves on. I actually have a sign in my office. You can take the girl out of Lawrence, but you can't take the Lawrence out of the girl, which is true. We consider ourselves to be pretty tough, right? Like, it was a tough community, and the 70s were a lot different, obviously, in terms of kids having free range and doing whatever and being gone all day. And living in a housing projects was really cool because we had a couple hundred kids that would be available at any time to do things. But Lawrence is a mill town. It's on the Merrimack River. It interestingly borders, another town that's very wealthy. So you have this real disparity that I noticed very much as a kid, And even within these very poor towns at the time, it was the 23rd poorest city in the country. I don't know if it still is. I imagine it probably is, if not more. At the time, it was so interesting to me because within Lawrence, there's also very much a class system, right? So in these poorer communities, people tend to also create these systems of, class where you have access to more resources, or at the time, I didn't know what it was called, but it was social capital. And that means that you have the ability to access resources and, get help and what have you if you need it. And you have access to things that others don't. And so what Andy didn't have really was social capital. I didn't know that. A lot of kids didn't, but there were some that did. So there were sections and neighborhoods of Lawrence, like there's the North Lawrence, there's South Lawrence, there's the Colonial Heights, there's Mount Vernon, there's the housing projects, and then there were 4 different housing projects, I believe, at the time. And it was funny because even the housing projects had rivalries with each other, so we were sort of, the stadium projects was it's right next to the Lawrence Stadium. And it was kind of the whiter project, right? It was sort of more of the, white community lived. And then there was the Beacon projects, was more mixed, a lot, white, but also people of color. And, then there was a project that was more Hispanic. So it was very segmented and, it was interesting. It's an immigrant city. There's a lot of diversity there. Lawrence has the best food, I think, going. Like, you can get some really good food when you go to Lawrence. One of my favorite restaurants actually is on the Methuen line, Greek restaurant. There's a lot of Lebanese community there, Spanish, Dominican, Irish, American. So it's just a melting pot, like you would imagine.
Feel free to name that Greek restaurant. Just give them a free plug.
Oh, yeah. The Greek restaurant is called Yala, and it's in Methuen. And it has, let me tell you, it has the best chicken, oh my God, skewers, with the rice pilaf. But when I first went there, and hummus and, fresh pita, when I first went there, I was saying to the waiter, it's family owned. And I was saying to the son of the family, oh, I love the pita and bread here. He said, oh, you came for that, but you're going to come back for the ashta. And I was like, well, what is ashta? And it is this incredible Greek dessert, which is just like Greek yogurt with like a drizzle of honey and some pistachios. And telling you, but that's what I love about Lawrence. It's a melting pot, and it's, it's full of survivors.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And can you tell us a little bit about Andy and your friendship with him?
Yeah. So, Andy was, he had moved into the projects in March, like I said, of that year, which was 4th grade. And I have 3 brothers, and I'm the youngest and the only girl. And we're all just about a year or a little bit more apart. So we're pretty close in age. And one of the brother closest to me, Jeff, had also been retained. So we were in the same grade. So a lot of our friends were the same friends, as we were growing up. A lot of people thought we were twins. So Andy was Jeff's friend first. They had met first, and they hung out. And then when I they were playing a football game one day, and I was, came out of my grandmother's house and wanted to play. And my brother was automatically like, no, you're not playing, which was typical. But Andy was really sweet and was like, I'm not going to play then if she can't play. And he was just like that. He was super sweet. And that's what everybody said about Andy and would still say about him. Like, he was very paternal. He was the oldest with 4 siblings, and one of whom was a baby sister who he carried everywhere. He always had Mandy on his hip. And he was just like a caring kid. He was the kind of kid that would notice things that maybe other kids wouldn't, like, a brother not letting his sister play football, and letting me play. And so when he did that, I kind of noticed him and thought he was cute. And I don't know, we just started hanging out together separately from my brother. We would, be friends together. And, I have a few memories. I have memories of like being on his porch. We all, back in the day, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have doorbells for the most part. We would do this really weird sing-song thing outside each other's house to go to each other's house to knock, parents didn't want us banging on the door all the time. So I don't know why we created in the projects this system of like standing outside and basically singing the person's name. It was really weird, but anybody from the stadium projects knows what I'm talking about. So, stand outside and be like, Andy, until they come out, and vice versa. And that's how you'd get together. It was kind of weird. But I remember being on his porch and him giving out cookies to his siblings, and, him giving them one to me first, and then making sure all of his siblings had one, and then coming back to give me a second one. So just considerate things like that. And he was cute. He had this shaggy kind of hairstyle that like would cover one of his eyes, and, he'd sort of move it back, and his eyes were brown, and he had like olive skin. He tanned really well. He had a really nice smile, and he was just sweet. He was a sweet boy. And, he had gotten a walkie-talkie shortly before he disappeared, and it was like a real walkie-talkie. It wasn't like a kid's toy one. It was like a real CB radio walkie-talkie, which was very big culturally at the time. CB radios were huge in the 70s. It was like this. It was kind of like the precursor to the internet. People could communicate, or the precursor to the iPhone. People could communicate, with people from far away using these amateur radios, CB radios. And so people created handles like Twitter names, like really like X names, like you had handles back then. And so it was really exciting. But what I didn't realize that it was also a way in which predators preyed on children, was using these amateur radios, and that was part of their system of communication. And so it makes me wonder, did Andy, was Andy exposed to that through the CB radio? I don't know, but anyway, he was a super sweet kid, and I miss him still.
And can you tell us a little bit about how he went missing?
Yeah. So, we had a swimming pool right across the street from the projects. And, I did research. It was built in 1973. So it was a few years before Andy disappeared. And it was a big deal when it was built, because it was, this big in-ground swimming pool right across the street with these 2 diving boards, a 12-foot dive and a low dive, high dive and small, short dive, whatever. And locker rooms and, a snack bar. And it was a big, big deal. And it was a municipal pool. So it was a state pool that was available for the entire city. But it was right across the street from our project. So we felt like it was our pool. And a lot of us didn't have the typical vacation. And so this was like our vacation. So every day we had a pool to go to. And we did. We used it constantly. And that particular day, I just remember, was really, really hot. And it was typical for us to just go and spend the entire day at the pool, or at least until you got so hungry that you had to go home if you didn't have money for the snack bar, which is what happened on that day. I had gone early with my brother, probably like 10 when it opened. And then it was probably around 2 or so that I was hungry. I'd been swimming for hours, and I was hungry, as anybody would be. Didn't have money for the snack bar. But I had this sense, and I don't know how to explain it to this day, but I tell my kids all the time, when you have this sort of inkling in your gut, go with it, because it's your body's way of telling you that there's something wrong. And that day I didn't want to walk home alone, and other days I would walk home alone. And when I say walk home, we were literally walking across the street. You could see Andy's house from the pool. You could see his front door from the pool. You would have to cross the street. There'd be like a little parking lot that was there for the stadium project's residents, and Andy's house, a laundry line in Andy's house. Behind Andy's house was my grandmother's house. To the left of my grandmother's house was our house, 1 unit, 2 units over. So it wasn't far. It wouldn't even be like a quarter mile to get to my house, but I didn't want to walk home that day alone. And I asked Andy. I remember they used to have forced breaks at the pool, because us kids would just swim until we couldn't swim anymore. So they would blow the whistle and make you get out for like 10 or 15 minutes and catch your breath and take a rest, so that you weren't just too fatigued. And so we were on a break, and, there was not a lot of shade in the pool. There's a little overhang, and if you were lucky, you got into that shade. And so Andy and a group of boys that included my brother and some neighborhood kids were sitting under that overhang. And so was I. I was hanging out with all of them. And I got up and said I was hungry and I wanted to go home. And I asked Andy if he would walk home with me. And he said no, he didn't want to leave yet. And I was disappointed because normally he would help if you asked him. But so then I said to my brother, well, will you walk me home? And my brother said no. And so then I told him I was going to tell my mother on. I was like, fine, I'm telling Ma. I was typical younger sister, turned around and went on my heels. And I guess, from the way he tells it, he thought twice and decided to jump up and walk home with me because he didn't want to get in trouble. And I fully intended to come back to the pool after I had eaten lunch. But I'm sure, once I got back home into the shade and after being out in the sun for 4 hours and swimming and having lunch or whatever, I'm sure I was probably just too tired. I decided not to go back. And then, around dinner time, I remember my brother saying something to me like, Andy's mom's looking for him. Have you seen him or something like that? And I was like, no, and I just figured he was going to get in trouble. It was dinner time and we were all supposed to be home at dinner time. Everybody was supposed to come home at dinner. That was kind of the rule. And so I just figured he was going to be in trouble. I didn't really think much more than that until the next morning when he still hadn't been. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, until the middle of the night, that night. I think it was that night. I don't have any evidence, but I remember the police being woken up by somebody banging on the door and my mother calling for my brother, Jeff, and I to come downstairs into the kitchen. And we went into the kitchen and there was a police officer there. And he was at the kitchen table asking us, when was the last time we had seen Andy, what he was wearing, what time we had left, just sort of all those details. And then, I knew something more was happening. But again, I didn't know. I thought, I had this really naive notion. I say this sometimes too. I thought like maybe he had been taken by this wealthy family and he'd get to go to Disney. I mean, like just the things a 9-year-old thinks, right? Like you just don't know. You're trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense.
I know you said that you couldn't really describe the feeling that you had, but is there any way that you can articulate that? Because we say that all the time on the show, like it's okay to have a bad feeling and go by your gut. And even if it makes you look a little silly in the meantime, it's fine because ultimately it will save you at some point.
Yeah, no, I do believe
like
that.
Your intuition.
Yeah, it is intuition. And so we all have intuition. And I think it's important for people to listen to it. I mean, it felt like there was danger, like felt like something in my stomach, like, you don't want to go home alone. I don't know. It was just a feeling like I tell my kids, like the hair on the back of your neck, right? Or like a funny feeling in your stomach or any of those things. It's sort of listening to your body. And the evidence for that for me was that I had asked them to walk me home because normally I wouldn't do that.
It has to be so frightening for a child to see police officers or at least one police officer in your home. And I feel like when they come into your home, they're huge. Like, aren't they just like much bigger than what you'd expect? It's almost like they can't fit in the door.
Yeah. They're bigger, they're shinier, they're bluer. Yeah. It's all of that, everything. And, what was even more scary was like, not long after that, there were like literally helicopters hovering over the projects and there were low flying planes and there were National Guard marching through like in troops, like an army marching through in their fatigues and people calling his name over and over again and everybody sort of scrambling to search. And it felt really surreal and definitely very scary. And initially thinking he's in big trouble now, like I was thinking, and I really didn't have any idea how much trouble he was really in and not, not from anybody that I think actually knew him, but more than we could have imagined. And, they had set up a whole headquarters in the parking lot of the exact theater that we went to screen the HBO documentary. They had set up a headquarters with CB radios. Truckers were sort of leading the search. And sort of that was the headquarters. And, people would go there to volunteer and people from all over the city volunteered. And yeah, that was really scary. And I think, my brothers remember searching for him. They remember going with the police and going into the woods searching for him and stuff like that. I don't remember actually searching for him. I feel like I was just this girl watching all of this little girl watching all of this activity, wondering what the heck was going on.
Yeah. And how did the next, several weeks develop as I know they stopped searching after, I think less than a week. And
6 days, yeah.
yeah.
And that was through like a ploy apparently that the police were using with Andy's mom to, there's literally a headline that says something about ploy, used or whatever. But according to Andy's mom, Faith, the police captain had gone to her and said, listen, we think that the person that's harboring Andy is really, probably scared from all of this activity from the search. And if we call off the search and stop it now, it'll get quiet and they'll be more likely to let him go and to feel more comfortable in letting him go. And so she agreed to that. And obviously that didn't happen. And so as a kid, what that felt like was really strange because we didn't have, back in that era, there was no like school counseling where like if this happened today, kids would, get counseling in a group, hopefully, and, people would be talking about it and doing something about it. There was none of that. And instead, there were no answers. Like nobody said anything to us. Like it just kind of got quiet. The adults kind of got quiet, or like they'd be whispering and you'd come in the room and they'd stop talking. I used to always read the newspaper because I love to read the funnies and my horoscope. Even at 9 years old, I would do that with my Nana, go over her house and, she'd give me the newspaper. And I remember for like, I don't know how long she wouldn't let me have the newspaper. And, I think they would just, turn off the radio, turn off the news, like try to keep it from us as much as they could. And so we didn't know what to think. And I think there were rumors, initially, like, I think people were saying like his father had taken him or his grandfather had taken him or, but I remember sadly what I felt like happened. And I think that they would agree, is that Andy's family sort of became ostracized in a way because it was almost like people felt like it was a contagion, right? Like it could be contagious or something. Like they just sort of like were like, and part of it might have been that they also just wanted to give them respect and space, but I don't think any of us really knew what to do, and certainly I know the kids were teased, I found out that later. I've talked to the siblings and stuff like that. And, but yeah, it was just, life went on and that was that.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The kids were teased about Andy's disappearance?
His siblings, yeah, like what might be like in middle school or whatever, sort of, middle school kids can be rough. But
they're evil.
They are evil, but they're dealing with, it's like, they are evil. I won't debate that.
For anyone out there who's, I'm just
we're
kidding.
They're
not
okay,
evil.
we're kidding, guys.
But they're pretty mean.
Wait till you have a middle schooler and you tell me.
Yeah, definitely recall middle school being the worst for all that. So after Andy went missing, years went by, you eventually decide to make this incredible documentary.
Thank you. We're looking for a streaming platform for it right now. The HBO license just ended, so I need to stream it again. So for folks that want to watch the documentary, we're working on it. It is currently being pirated on YouTube, but we're working on that stopping as well. So for folks out there, when people pirate your stuff, it's not cool. People work really hard to make content. So we wish people wouldn't do that, but we'll get it streaming and we'll make sure people have access to it. But I worked on it with some really great and talented people. My editor was Rachel Clark and John Cusiak did the music. And I had this experience, like I said, of working in documentary film. So I knew good editors, I knew, good composers and stuff like that. So it was, as it always is, was a matter of like getting the money to be able to do it. Right. So I worked a part-time job that I would use that money then to fund the project. My husband was, the main breadwinner in the family. So we were able to do that. And so I think it was like 7 or 8 years, I worked on that documentary off and on while raising my family. My kids were in elementary school at the time, had no idea how hard that was going to be, making a story about, pedophilia and CSA and all that kind of stuff and having children, young children. So that made it even harder because when I had started, I was just getting married. I didn't have children. And then when I finished, I had children. So it was really hard. It was a lot of work and really hard, but we did it. We got it done. And we're really proud of it. We were really glad HBO picked it up. They came in at the last hour, really. And when we had a rough cut and we were able to pitch it to them, and And they took it, and we were really grateful that they did, because we were able to get the word out on a scale that, was really amazing. Millions of people have seen it from all over the world. And in fact, I have this great poster in my office that I really love from a woman from China that sent me a poster-sized puzzle with a picture of Andy, but all of the little pieces of the puzzle are Chinese children making a heart for Andy. And her, she promises that she will educate children about child safety and how to protect themselves in China because of Andy's story. So that's just one example of a way that we really hoped that the story would affect people, and it has.
That's amazing.
Thanks. Yeah. It's a real labor of love for anybody that's seen it, and again, that was 20 something years ago. I'm like, 30 something in it. And I'm really good friends with the forensic anthropologist in that film that I met actually when she was excavating what we thought was a shallow grave that might have Andy's remains. And we've since become very close friends, Dr. Anne-Marie Myers, and she's amazing. She's a forensic anthropologist. She worked at the ME's office at the time. And subsequently, she helped recover Molly Bish and Holly Peranian, and was involved with Sarah Pryor, but also all of Whitey Bulger's victims. I mean, she's quite remarkable. And her and I host Missing Children's Day every year, and we do a lot of work around advocating for missing children. And she's involved in these searches, and she continues to search for Andy. When we get a lead, she's able to work with law enforcement. She's not at the ME's office anymore, but she's able to collaborate as an expert with law enforcement and help with some of these searches, and not just Andy's case, in a number of missing children's cases. So she is just a real gem for the community. We're really, very, very lucky to have her. So, but we've kept on, and she's sort of like, Faith says, Andy's mom, Faith, says that, like, I'm probably the only other person that understands all of the things that happened to Andy the way that she does, which is an incredible compliment, obviously, and, makes me really humble to think that, and also has made us close because of that. And I also feel like the only sort of counterpart that I have that really understands the work and what we've been doing and everything is Dr. Myers. Like, she's been in it since the beginning and continues to be in it. So we've been really grateful for that.
Yeah, and it definitely must have taken a whole excellent team to put that together. And you mentioned pedophilia and sort of digging into this subject as you have kids. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and I guess this Pandora's box that is this topic?
Yeah. So, essentially early on, actually, in between, the time that Andy disappeared and before I started to make the documentary, Faith had done an interview in the 90s, I think it was, with WCVB Chronicle. And she had said something to one of the newscasters there that the police had told her that there were 5 known child molesters at the pool the day Andy disappeared. And again, I want to be really clear. We didn't have the words that we have today, and that makes a big difference, right? So there was no sex offender word. There was not like a pedophile. It was child molesters was what people were called. And also we didn't have the word human trafficking. We didn't have, when you don't even have the words, you don't even know these things exist, really. And so it's important to name things. And that's why we talk about things clearly, and we do name things. So there were 5 known pedophiles at the pool the day Andy disappeared, according to what law enforcement had told Faith. And that always struck me like, what? There were all these kids there in bathing suits, and we were there all day long. And like, there were who were these people? And so I just started, again, super naively, to try to figure out who could these people be? And what I ended up finding was that there were very likely a lot more than 5 known pedophiles at the pool that day. I mean, I think I'm up to 12 that were in a quarter-mile radius. And we didn't have a sex offender registry then, Advocacy changes things, which is another reason we do what we do, is because we do a lot of legislative advocacy too. So, Jacob Wetterling, that case was what created a sex offender registry. So, laws are created for reasons. I would find out in the course of making the podcast as well that, the first laws against CSAM, then known as child pornography, and we don't call it child pornography today because that suggests that the children are willing, and that they're selling themselves. It's not that, it's child sex abuse material. And, but we didn't really know about that back then, or what was going on with things back then. There was no laws against it even. Like, I found out that in 1977, there were congressional hearings because so many children were going missing across the country, and because there was so much exploitation of children, that congressional hearings were held. And the first law against the sexual exploitation of children was created in 1977, the year after Andy disappeared. And it was because of advocates who saw what was happening with runaways and marginalized kids, and how this was already in the 1970s a billion-dollar industry in America. And people just didn't know, never heard of it. And at that time, the Polaroid was very popular. The Polaroid camera was very popular, and that was a very easy way for pedophiles and others to exploit children, because you didn't have to develop that film. But even in our case, like the main suspect in Andy's case was caught, Wayne W. Chapman was caught, 10 days after Andy disappeared or so, a couple of weeks, through a traffic violation in upstate New York. And when they pulled him over, he had a dashboard with all these Polaroid pictures of naked children. But he also had, essentially a child, abuse kit. He had tape, rope, handcuffs, a fake police badge, a starter pistol. He had 8mm films, of him observing children. He had CSAM material, magazines. He had addresses in Boston for where to go to get the magazines. He had maps that were marked off. We don't know what they mean. He had audio tapes of himself recording himself watching children that excited him. We don't know if he was alone when he was recording those or if he was doing them for other people. And I learned a lot about how people who have these sicknesses try to normalize them. And they do that through sharing material with other people with like-minded interest, right? So, and that's how they build a network. And back then you didn't have email to do that, or, whatever. You met people in person and you exchanged material in person. And so, person-to-person meetings would foster sort of more relationships, more relationship building, and you could create little mini organizations, if you will. You were a quilter, you were in a quilting club, like to, I don't know, play piano, you joined other piano players or what have you, but these people preferred to abuse children, and they would find each other, and they did find each other. And so, Wayne Chapman had been at the pool the year before Andy disappeared. He had abducted 2 other children that he had taken into the woods and raped, while those children heard a clicking noise that they believe was somebody taking pictures while this was happening, which I agree with. And again, this evolved over time. Like, I didn't know this all in the beginning. So this is, again, 20 plus years worth of research. So I might not know in the beginning that, I knew that about the boys being taken, but I didn't know that they heard a clicking noise in the woods and that they thought somebody else was there taking pictures. That's not in the police reports. That's after interviewing them and them telling me that, and that sort of lending itself again to this idea that Wayne Chapman wasn't working alone, which I don't believe he was. And he had a dark room in his apartment where he was developing pictures. He was a janitor. I mean, I don't know where he was getting very expensive camera equipment that he had, it was very expensive. And even later, when I would start to research other people, clergy members that were abusing children, others, one of the first things I would ask was, were they involved in, child pornography, CSAM? And initially I would get, oh no, like Paul Shanley, the notorious street priest. I initially was told, no, he was not involved. Like I never heard that about him or whatever, And then I go and research, and I'd be reading the affidavits about him. And one of the kids would say there was a camera built in the ceiling over his bed. And it was like, this was the 1970s. Like, a camera installed in the ceiling over your bed is like a lot of money. That takes somebody to install it. It takes, that's a big deal. And nobody ever talks about the fact that Paul Shanley had a camera installed over his bed, except for the victims. The reason that he had a camera installed over his bed is because he was producing CSAM, undoubtedly. And then the question is whether it was for himself or others. That's not a question for me. I'm sure it was for himself and others, but none of those priests, really, none of the clergy, none of those people were prosecuted for CSAM. And I think they should have been. They certainly were taking, there's a lot of them that were taking pictures. And it was, very organized. And I say in the podcast, we talk about RICO, and we have a state police officer saying, why wasn't it an organized crime sort of, investigation? And I even interviewed more recently the former Attorney General Martha Coakley, and she was former district attorney in Middlesex as well. And I asked her that question, and why wasn't it investigated as organized crime or as a RICO? And, and she said that wasn't up to her. That was up to the federal government, so they chose not to at the time.
So mind blowing, right? Like, why is that even a question? Why would they even consider not doing that?
Politics, I assume, right? I mean, that's all
Yeah.
one can assume, politics and money. But I mean, the other thing is that even today we're advocating, and this is important. I want to make sure that, you guys include this because we've been advocating for a while, and, victims of clergy abuse have been advocating for a while for, the governor to release a report on all 4 dioceses in Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, we have Boston, Fall River, Springfield, and Worcester. And back in like 2002, when the Boston Globe Spotlight team, blew this whole story open and became national and international, and became a, Academy Award winning film and everything else, the then Attorney General wrote a report on the Boston diocese. But again, that report is 20 something years old. We've learned a lot more since that report. But in addition, the Worcester, Springfield, and Fall River dioceses have never had a full grand jury report and investigation. And they need to, because there's a lot there. And we know, even, for example, in Springfield, Danny Croto, an altar boy who was killed by a priest who, we were advocating and working in the day, Missing Children's Day was when, right after it was over and we had our event was when, District Attorney Gallooni, who is very much a friend to families and friends of those who are murdered and missing, announced that he was naming, Father Richard Levine as the person who murdered Danny Croto, 12-year-old Danny Croto, altar boy. And honestly, when he said that, I thought the world was going to change. Like, I thought the next morning the world was going to change and people were going to be like, wow, a priest is responsible for murdering an altar boy in Massachusetts. Like, whoa. And it wasn't even a blip on the news. It was just like, not even a blip. And I just don't understand it. And so we're still advocating for those reports. Essentially we're hearing, or we've heard, that the Attorney General has done some investigation of those dioceses and that reports will be released, but they haven't yet. And the survivors still advocate for that. And they should be, because like what happened in Philadelphia when that report was released was people could really see the systemic nature of the abuse and the ways in which children were shared. They were brought across state lines. They were, brought to camps outside of the state, and more than one person was involved in abuse at any given time of these children. So that is a network.
Okay, we'll be back tomorrow with part 2 of this conversation and our final thoughts. We'll also get deeper into this network of pedophiles. Thanks a lot for listening. Please like and subscribe.